Chapter 10.5, Interlude, A Resounding Echo. The day was a normal one for the male lizard. He popped his head out of his home's hole just a bit after sunrise. The chill air caused a shiver after being warm, snuggled around his family. He was the defender of his family, and as such, he came out first to check for danger and make sure it was safe for his family to follow. Spear in hand, he looked all around the perimeter, seeing a few other lizards already out and about, and some going through the same motions as himself. The coast clear, he shimmered down to his tail for the family to see before jumping out, his family not far behind. The little ones were all too eager to get out of the hole and start the day, and jumped past one of their fathers to soak in the early morning sun. The defender had vague memories of doing the same when he was young. It made the back of his neck shimmer with nostalgia and affection. He felt a familiar bump on both his sides as his beloved female and male physically expressed their own affection while watching the little ones gallivant around. His family often spent moments like this in the morning before procuring food. Some of the holes near the center of their colony served as stockpiles so that any lizard could eat when they were hungry, and that's where his family headed now. The defender walked hunched over on two legs, periodically using his free hand to balance on the ground. The little ones followed the adults on their own erratic path, the three of them running and leaping around, their scales a whirl of color. It was good for them to be energetic and play together. They came upon the food stores and the adults greeted each other before consuming their fill. One of the defender's children seemed to be eating more than her fill, and received a bump on the nose from her defender father, a reminder to not be greedy. She offered the extra food she'd shoved in her mouth to one of her brothers and he gladly ate the sloppy seconds. Waiting for his family to finish, he looked towards the sky. Today was a clear day, a good day to clean out the dirty foliage in their hole before the rains came again. Their holes were porous and the rainwater usually ran right through, but would sometimes get stopped up by the old foliage, making it sopping wet and unpleasant smelling. The little ones were big enough to help with the chores, and thought this would be a good exercise for their rambunctious little selves, as well as teaching them about keeping the family hole cleanly. He communicated his intention with his family unit, and the other two adults felt it was a good idea. Getting back to the hole, his beloved male affectionately bumped him again before going down. His two mates were both quite physically affectionate, but the male even more so. As a good defender, he kept an eye out for predators, despite not being close to their colony border, and an ear out for warning calls. The little ones followed the adults out, carrying as much foliage as possible, trying their best to be helpful. The defender shimmered in a laugh around his face at the little leaf monsters that had replaced his children. They carried the dead bedding in their hands, tucked under their shoulders, and in their mouths, each trying to outdo the other sibling for carrying the most. Prideful flashes adorned their backs as they followed their other parents to the forest edge to deposit the used greens. The defender brought up the rear, steering his little ones in the right direction since they could hardly see past all the foliage they carried. He felt they walked very well on two legs, and they rarely tripped themselves up. A flash came over them suddenly. No, was it a warning cry? His heart hammered and he immediately got defensive. His family dropped their loads and huddled behind their defender. Another wave came over him, over his family as well. It was painful. He had no injuries but it hurt his heart. The hurt felt similar to when his female was having a hard time laying eggs and was in a great amount of pain. Her pain had been his pain, and he could feel it. This was the same. He knew his family also felt it, for they were clinging to him not out of fear, but out of comfort. If his family didn't have each other, surely it would have been too overwhelming. He looked around and all the other family units he could see were huddled together as they were, all seeking comfort from each other. Something was grievously wrong, they could all feel it in their family heart. It felt like a desperate shimmer in their minds. It was loud and thundering, yet weak and helpless. Something inside them was crying out that one of their family was hurt. It felt so very fragile, like a newly laid egg before the shell hardened. He did not know where it came from, but he sought to comfort it, just as he had his female when she had been in great pain. Just as he comforted others when they were hurting. He did not know where this member of his family was, but he sought to give them peace. His body shimmered in soothing waves of color. It was like a light in his heart had lit up. It was not a light that could be seen, but he could feel it. He could feel it in his males and females' hearts. He could feel it in his children's hearts. He could feel it in the heart of every member of his colony and beyond. He had been close to all of his extended family, but now he felt them. What had been a faint sense of others seemed like trying to catch a glimpse of the sun through a canopy of dense trees. Now it was like all the trees were ripped away and the sun shone marvelously in the sky, warming his scales, and the scales of all the other lizards he could not see before for the shadows of the trees. It was a great coming together of hearts. The flash that had been so startling and fearful turned into a strong wave of something entirely different, something joyous and fulfilled. There was not a sound nor a shimmer that could describe the feeling of completeness he now had. And just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. No, not completely gone. It was there, he could feel it in his family heart, like it was alive and pulsing next to his body's heart. His spear dropped, and he put his freed hand to the center of his chest where he felt the dull, living pulse. His chest shimmered in a light blue around his hand at the content feeling now living within him, a deep connection to one and all of his family. His family unit saw his action and did the same, each placing a hand upon their chest and shimmering in that same content light blue. Another family seeing them also copied the gesture, and just like that, it spread like wildfire across his colony and all the other colonies. It was a new word, one that would stay with them long through the ages. It meant family heart. Chapter 11, A Time for Rest. I thought the darkness and emptiness of my own heart would consume the whole of my being. But they, all of them, showed me I was not alone. How had I been so blind? I couldn't say for certain that I would never have doubts in the future, but now I knew I could entrust my feelings to them. I was not alone. My comfort did not end there. I now had a name. All the lizards knew me by name. Every time their chests shimmered with that light blue, I knew I was one of them. I then did something I hadn't done for a long while. To the one who gave me my name, I called the name-bearer. He was a very diligent defender, a loving father, and an adoring mate. If I had a father, I could only hope mine was as caring as him. How strange! I used to be filled with such anxiety when I thought of my unknown past, clinging to bits and pieces of it as if it were my last lifeline. I was now freed of that chain that bound me to my past. I still desired to know where I had come from and how I got here, but I knew who I was now, even if that was different from whatever me existed in the past. I was the overseer to these lizards, my lizards. It was not just my role, it was my entire being. And to these little creatures that had saved me from myself, I would give them everything of me. In the dark rift, I thought massive amounts of time would pass like the other times I'd been separated from my lizards, but surprisingly, it lasted only an instant. Not even just the same generation of lizards, it was still the same day, the sun still climbing into the sky, not yet at its zenith. For the rest of this generation of lizards, I merely watched them. I did not push them forward nor steer them in any direction. I simply wanted to watch them live. The name-bearer didn't have many children with only a single female in his family unit, but he had many grandchildren, and he lived a very long time compared to the average lizard. He was never content to live with the rest of the old and frail, and patrolled and protected his colony until he could move no longer. Their lives were getting longer. They ate well, protected their colonies from predators, and their living conditions were ideal. Their breeding seasons were also spread farther apart as the colonies become inundated with many surviving young. During the name-bearer's lifetime, a far-away forest colony had a small group break off to start a new colony, and they finally reached the other side of the massive forest that lined the rocky shores. The previous forest colony had been situated on an incline, and the new group finally broke past the dense forest to a more sparsely decorated mountain. This far from the shore, the rock was not porous and full of holes, but glossy black and solid. The new branch colony stuck to the sparse trees in the area. In addition to the trees being less dense, the trees at this higher elevation were thinner. I would likely need to help them adapt to the mountainside in due time, but at the moment I enjoyed their struggles, banding together to overcome them, and figuring out how to make their new home work. As the new colony was finally getting fully settled into their new mountain trees, the name-bearer neared the end of his life. He had a hard time waking up in the mornings, his mates no longer there to rub affectionately against his sides. But this morning, I could see him brace himself as though they were there by his side. No, they were there by his side, through me that lived in his family heart. It was finally time for him to go. It had been a good, long life. I welcomed him into the arms of my memories, next to his family who had left before him. Having received him, I voiced my thoughts to his memory, "You've done well, now you can rest." Chapter 12, The Hidden Signal. With the name-bearer coming to rest within my memories, it was finally time to return to my duties as an overseer. I had a positive new outlook, and while still ambitious for their advancement, it did not feel as zealous and all-consuming as it had at one point. The new mountainside colony wasn't faring very well. The higher elevation without the protection of dense trees gave way to colder temperatures and high winds. Quite a number died off during the even colder winter months, and only families of 4 or 5 seemed to generate enough warmth at night, and sometimes even that was barely enough. The lizards realized this as well, so the families of 2 and 3 grouped together for warmth. It was a sad event. They clung together in love and in death as the cold took them away. What could I do for them so that more wouldn't die? Should I urge them back to the forest? They were trying so hard to make out here on the mountainside, but it was harsh. If they were to succeed in colonizing the mountain, something had to change, and quickly. I didn't have the luxury of time to slowly adapt them. Did I have something locked away in my memories that could compensate? I let myself drift, deep in thought. Something, anything to help them. I was hit suddenly by inspiration. It crashed through my mind like a wave during high tide crashing upon the rocky cliffs. It burned, it was hot. My essence was a flame in the memory that was let loose. Fire. Controlled fire. Another rekindled memory of long ago. It felt powerful, necessary even, and I wondered why I had not thought of it before. It was useful for so many things, things I could not remember other than warmth. The lizards were smart, they would think of many uses for it, perhaps all the ones I could not. I knew fire almost as well as I knew thumbs. I could remember its importance, even if I couldn't remember all its uses. I knew what it was, but then came a problem. How do you make fire? I could remember fire and that it could be made, but I wasn't able to recall the method. And then came yet another problem. I had no idea how to show them the advantage of controlled fire. To them, fire usually meant death, and was something to avoid. Forest fires were a very real danger for the forest dwellers, and most creatures had a natural fear of fire. Thankfully, the tall red-barked trees in the forest had adapted to be resistant to fire, though not immune. It was difficult for forest fires to spread where the trees were more sparse, but the denser areas suffered the most damage from fire. When such forest fires were spotted, the forest colonies completely vacated the area until the fires died down, hoping their homes wouldn't be touched, but not taking any chances. Having branched from the forest colony, the fear of fire would be very ingrained in them. Could I dull their fear? I did not know. Before I could show them fire, I had to do something about that fear. I couldn't get rid of the fear, fire was inherently dangerous and they must remain wary. Even controlled fire had its dangers. A related memory? It was more of a notion, but I knew it to be true. There were so many ifs, so many problems. First, I should see if I could find the root of their fear. Perhaps something would come to me once I found it. I looked towards one of the families huddled close together in a hole of a tree. Their hole was sunk past the opening in the side of the tree, but the chill early spring wind still blew freely through it, and the foliage they gathered could only insulate it so much. I reached out to one of the lizards in there, an older female. She had one surviving hatchling after the winter, and held him close in the center of her family's huddled pile of bodies. I touched her and felt myself flow through her. I went deep, deep inside her. I did not know what I was looking for, I could only hope I would know when I stumbled upon it. I felt through her memories. She had been young when her parents had relocated her family to the mountainside colony, but she was still one of the founding members, most of the adults were. But what I looked for did not come from her memories. I let myself drift through her, her anxious emotions for her family and what tomorrow may bring, and hoping that her last young son would wake up every morning. Her fears were well founded with the loss of 4 young in her family in just the last winter. But I still desired to give her peace of mind. I sent her feelings of reassurance through her family heart, our connection, and I could feel her physical body relax around me. It was all I could do until I found what I didn't know I was looking for. Her pulse was soft during rest, but it was still strong and healthy. She wouldn't succumb to the elements easily. Her nerves remained sensitive to changes in her environment so that she could wake at a moment's notice. But again, this was not what I sought. I drifted farther, deeper. There must be something here, something just waiting for me to find it. I saw she had eggs that only recently been fertilized, just in the last few days. It would still be a while before they were ready to be laid. I counted 4 in total, and hope all survived the incubation period. I could feel myself drifting closer to an egg, still in the early stages of development. The tiny embryo was slowly increasing in size, feeding off nutrients provided by the healthy mother. Although I had always felt the development stage, this was the first time I felt like I had seen it. How strange that this small strange creature would grow to be a beautifully scaled lizard by the time it hatched. I looked closer at where its scales developed from, curious to see where the dark scale that could shine in so many colors originated. It was easily found, ready to be developed, just waiting for its turn to grow with the rest of the young embryo. I got even closer and found something strange about it. I could see many signals pulsing through its undeveloped body, telling pieces where to form and grow. The scales also received a signal, but in that signal I saw a potential I did not know existed. It was so surprising, I didn't know what to make of it at first. The signal that was being sent held many possibilities, all contained right here in this underdeveloped scale. I reached for it, touched it. I could change it. I could give the signal different instructions, tell it give more or less components to the scale. The possibility already existed here, it just needed to be tweaked. I felt myself shimmer with a strange kind of laughter. I was both elated and flabbergasted. I did not find the root of their fear of fire, I found something far more incredible. I reached out to the other developing eggs, giving their signal the same instructions. It all existed right here. They would need fire in the future, but I could ease them into it. This right here would save their future generations along the mountainside. I stepped back and watched as the embryonic lizards developed inside their mother, then inside the eggs after they were laid, until finally they hatched. The fluid of the egg made them damp and strange looking, and even their parents did not know what to think when the 4 hatched. Their older brother, who had made it through the cold spring, looked upon his young siblings with the same curious expression. There was a strange coat adorning the 4 lizards, wet with birth fluid. Their mother set in to lick the remaining fluid off them, perhaps trying to remove whatever strange thing had stuck to them before they hatched. Her 3 males followed suit with the other 3, each taking one under their care. The licking didn't get rid of the strange coat, but did help to dry it. Not long after their first bath, the dry coat flared out, unhindered by the wet. I found them adorable. Each small lizard had a fine layer of fuzz upon their skin. It was incredibly soft, and best of all, warm. It could even shimmer the same way the scales of their parents could. Although it resembled it, the fuzz was not the fur coat of a mammal. It was primitive feathering. Chapter 13, To Protect. Though found strange, each lizard's family heart could tell that these fuzzy little lizards were part of their family. The downy fuzz not only kept the little ones warm, but also those around them, it had great heat retention. Though I could do nothing for the already developed lizards, I set about a task to bring that same layer of fuzz to all the newly fertilized lizards still growing inside their mothers. The task was so simple, it hardly had any effect on me. I could even continue tending the bipedal and gill developments. It was surprising, but I was glad. With this, the mountain colony could survive. My feelings of relief echoed in the hearts of the mountain colony. Although their children were being born looking strange, they could feel the contentment in their family heart, and were at ease. Never could I have thought, in my panic to save them, that it could be something so small and simple. I was capable of saving them. I had no body to give them warmth, but I had been able to provide them that needed warmth all the same. A feeling fluttered deep inside me. When I felt isolated, I didn't think I was capable of saving anyone. There were so many that died before old age could take them, I couldn't save them all. But just because I couldn't save them all didn't mean I couldn't save some. I didn't have to be content to be a bystander and simply watch them as the harshness of nature took them. I could still save some of them. The feeling empowered me and inspired me. I was their overseer, but now I could also be a protector. I could protect my family, the ones I loved. I was nearly awash with sentiment, but something came to me. It was a memory. It flooded my vision and other senses, completely engulfing me. It was screams, it was pain. The air was rank with blood and fear. A hand, not unlike the one I had created for my lizards, reached for me, drenched in the dark ichor of blood. A wave of pain was sent through me, physical pain in my body, emotional pain reaching back for that hand. Behind the hand was dark, shadows thrown over everything from bright light surrounding me. There were noises I could not understand, but they were desperate and gut-wrenching. The noises were coming from me. My lizards were panicked. I was suddenly brought back to reality. The shock of my relived memory had flowed through my family heart and into them. I calmed myself, and the wave of panic ceased in the lizards. They were confused, not understanding where the source of fear had come from. I was just as confused as they were. All my previous snippets of memory had been short flashes, something visual, emotional, or even just a word, never so much at once. It was a sensory overload in the form of a memory. And I was sure the memory had been of me, not merely the world around me. The pain I felt in my body was real. I had once had a body, that much was clear. I didn't know how to feel about that. The glimpses before had never been so solidly identifying. I had a notion that I might have had a body, but not having one now, it had been difficult to imagine, like telling the blind what colors looked like. The sensation of feeling, for all its hurt and pain, was mystifying. I had felt plenty of emotional pain since awakening as an overseer, but physical was something different altogether. I could experience a body through my lizards, but I was still very much detached. I actually felt closer to them now than I had before. I could now empathize with their physical pain. I wanted to see the memory again, but I was afraid of it. I felt myself desiring the physical body, for all its pain, yet I was conflicted as I was currently at peace with myself. Would I desire it too much? Would it cause me to abandon my lizards to try and find a way to achieve a physical body? I didn't want that. My fear came from myself, afraid of my own potential greed. Surely if I kept thinking about it by myself I would run around in circles as before. I decided to entrust those feelings to my family heart. The comfort that answered back was so incredibly reassuring, I wondered how I ever thought I might abandon them for such a selfish whim. There were also a few other feelings that responded, something that told me it was okay to be selfish. I felt through the connections in my family heart to see which lizards felt that way. I had expected it to be from the young, but they were surprisingly mostly from middle-aged adults. With their experience and wisdom, they knew you could not always only act for others, sometimes you must act for yourself. Particularly for the young. Was I still young? I had lived through so many generations of families, it was hard to think of myself as such, but perhaps I was for an overseer. I was so worried my selfish actions might negatively impact my lizards, I had forgotten the most important points of family. Acceptance and forgiveness. They would be there for me, no matter what my decision. And should that decision lead to a mistake, I would learn from it, and they would be there to show me back to the right path. Some decisions may not be understood, but families still love each other regardless. An intense wave of love, contentment, and trust, emotions deep from my core, spread out to all my lizards. It was the same deep love a family held for their child that filled their life with light. How lucky was I to be their overseer. Although I knew many things, they always taught me more. I decided to revisit the memory. It was painful, but I was prepared. The physical body that encased me was so familiar, it must have been my own. That hand that reached for me from the dark contrasted room, it was a room I was in, who did it belong to? Something akin to my family heart reached out for them, family, surely that hand belonged to family. The memory was the longest one I'd had, yet it was still so bitterly short. I relived the memory over and over, trying to glean something from it. The bright light that cast the room in such stark contrasting lights and shadows came from fire that washed out most color. Both the hand and I were in pain, the desire to protect blazed through me, stronger than the flames that discolored the memory. There was also a darkness in that heart. The darkness threatened to cast the world asunder, all for the sake of that reaching hand. I wasn't familiar with that strong, dark emotion. But the more I felt it, the more the words came to mind. Hate. Scorn. Revenge. It was not directed towards the hand, but to whatever had hurt that bleeding hand. The emotions left me cold, a dark pit formed in my essence from it. Had the memory gone on longer, would the me from the memory be consumed by those emotions? I hoped not, but nothing reassured me to the contrary. I fell away from the memory and indulged in the love of my family heart, seeking their warm embrace from the blazing and cold emotions of the memory. If I hadn't created the family heart so long ago, would those same emotions have taken over my lizards? I didn't know, but I was glad they did not have to feel it. I wanted to take on that burden for them, and not let it consume them. I would rescue them from the dark of those cold, bitter emotions, just like they had rescued me from my dark rift. Such emotions were beyond them in their current development, but they would come one day. And thanks to my memory, I would be ready for them. Chapter 14, A Ripple in a Pool. I was still mildly bothered by my previous memory. It answered a few of my questions about myself. I had lived before I was an overseer, I'd had a body, a family. If my nostalgic feelings were anything to go off of, I'd had hands and walked on 2 legs, or at the very least my family had hands. The fire from the memory was uncontrolled, dangerous, and I could feel a distinct fear of it. It made me less inclined to teach my lizards about fire. The dark emotions I'd felt in the past were equally upsetting. They were from a time long ago, but in the memory they were strong, raw emotions that threatened to take the place of my heart. I had known about those emotions before the memory. It had only been an inkling of them, but I knew they had the power to destroy. They were the reason I created the family heart when I first saw my lizards fighting. I spent a long time contemplating the memory. Soon, the mountainside colony all had the protective fuzz of early feathering. Sometimes individuals or families would migrate to them, and I simply ensured their children would be protected from the cold as well. When those from the mountainside colony mingled with the nearby forest colonies, while looked at curiously, they were still very much accepted by their brethren. Being able to shimmer and flash their short, fur-like feathers made them able to maintain the standard communication of all lizards. Seeing those feathers, it created ideas in the minds of the still-scaled lizards. Although they had few real predators anymore, back when I first came to them, small, furry mammals and rodents had been a common source of predation. With their tools and cooperative teamwork, they were no longer a threat, and could easily be scared off or killed if they were too aggressive. Not wanting to waste precious food if they killed their enemy, they ate the raw meat, sharing it among the colony. The bones could be used for tools, but anything else was simply tossed aside. After seeing the mountainside colony lizards, they got the idea that the fur could be used for warmth. The forest might not be as cold as the mountainside, but they had their fair share of cold winters which sometimes took the very young or the very old. If they could save the pelts of the furred animals, it could help many lizards, and particularly for the scaled ones who moved to the mountainside without warm feathering of their own. I didn't even have to help guide them for such a thing, their own ingenuity made it possible to bring this idea to life. They had always been very smart when it came to tools. They discovered how to use a rock before I came to them, and with only the addition of hands, they became able to make weapons and other tools while I had been lost to the abyss. They were very intelligent, and I was very proud of them. I didn't have to hold their hand to lead them forward, I just needed to provide some inspiration. They were perfectly capable of the rest. It didn't take long for the idea of fur blankets to spread to the other colonies, they were very good at sharing ideas with each other. Clothing in fur pelts wasn't far behind. They had learned to take the vines that kept the spearheads attached to their spears, and make twine from the fibers, stronger than just the vine by itself. Using the twine, they stitched the pelts together using small sharp bones so that a lizard could wear the pelt hands-free. For the sake of pelts, the mammals and rodents that had once been merely chased away were now actively hunted by the lizards. While defenders still made up the bulk of the fighting force, non-defenders also took up spears to hunt, and learned to track their new furry prey. It all came so fast, I was amazed. In only a few generations, the colonies had changed rapidly. And it had all started with the lizards who so desperately tried to survive on the cold mountainside. I was sure they would never cease to amaze me. The clothing didn't take in the shore colonies, living in and out of the water made them impractical. Instead, they took the idea of adorning oneself with fur pelts for warmth, to stringing together pretty seashells with the twine and decorating themselves simply for looks. It was amazing to watch an idea develop on one side of the population and have it turn into something brand new on the other side. The new idea of decorating oneself spread as fast as a wildfire. It sparked creativity the likes of which hadn't existed before. In addition to physical and visual affection, families now often gave each other handmade presents to show their love for one another as well. For them, it was just another way to express love for their family. It was incredibly heartwarming to see the lizards work so hard on their presents for one another. Even if they weren't very good at it, the effort and love put into it was clear, and they were loved all the more for it. Items that were previously ignored as useless found new life as simple decoration, like small or weak bones, sparkling rocks that couldn't be used for tools, even the bark of some trees. They decorated their heads, necks, waists, tails, arms, hands, legs, anywhere they could hold a decoration. Some were so inundated with baubles you almost couldn't see their scales, but it was too cumbersome to be practical that way. Most wore decorations in just one or two places. Hunters and trackers wore ones that didn't make noise when they hunted outside the colony borders. Some had also taken to carving designs in the pole weapons, which, as the ideas that came before it, spread to many other aspects of carving designs into tools and other decorations. So much change from something so simple. Like a rock cast into water that rippled onward to the edge of the pool. Despite my reservations from my memory, I knew I must teach them about fire. They would do so many things with it, it would change their lives again, for the better I was certain. But I was woefully ill-prepared for the disaster that would come shortly after they achieved that fire. Chapter 15, The Age of Fire. It was right around the time when carving was becoming the next big thing to hit the lizard world. Panels of bark from rotting logs became a prime medium for carved pictures. Crude though they were, being cut into with stone knives, it was still a fascinating process to watch. Most designs were simple straight lines, sometimes crisscrossing each other, and rarely something more elaborate like curved lines would be made. They even took to making representations of themselves in the wood carvings. Simplistic, stick-like lizards began to adorn the wood panels. From that inspired actual stick lizards, thin sticks wrapped together with twine that resembled a lizard if one used their imagination. They were quite popular with the children. There was suddenly a boom of new creative duties lizards could perform in addition to food gathering, hunting, colony protection, child rearing, teaching, and general caretaking. Most lizards didn't stick to a single job, preferring to maximize their talents in several areas. Times when lizards would laze under the sun, soaking up its rays, were instead spent on more creative ventures. Trade began between the families and the colonies. Shell decorations from the shore colonies were popular with the forest dwellers, and likewise the bark panels were popular with the shore colonies. The solid, non-porous rocks of the mountainside colonies were found useful by all, and made better tools and weapons. Their civilization was expanding by leaps and bounds. I had already stopped touching on the bipedal change, as it was, for all intents and purposes, complete. Lizards rarely had trouble walking on two legs, and their tails made for great counterweights with their mildly hunched-over posture. Their original feet had seemed a bit flimsy, but with the bipedal movement they became larger, stronger, and thicker to carry the mass of the lizard upright. Their strong legs carried them fast across the ground as they ran, and their long arms could still deftly wield large weapons and small tools. It was the culmination of everything I had desired. Again, they were growing larger than previous generations, to the point that they now had to carve into the porous holes in the black rock near the shore to make them large enough to accommodate their families. It was nearly overwhelming to me the speed at which they were changing. With some of my influence freed up, I set about the process of dulling their fear of fire. During the last few forest fires that resulted from lightning storms, I had paid close attention to where the fear came from, and now latched onto that to lessen, though not dismiss, its power over them. And then came a moment when a small lizard was hard at work trying to make a design in a wood panel, and it was almost as if the lizards had discovered fire themselves, unknowingly. The little lizard was using a sharp stick to bore a hole deep into the panel of wood. The stick wasn't gripped. The lizard had found a lazy way to bore in the hole just the way he liked it by moving his hands back and forth in opposite directions with the stick in between, causing it to spin rapidly. A very tiny, thin wisp of smoke appeared. The lizard stopped to inspect the strange smell coming from his wood panel, but I was inundated with a memory triggered by that same little plume. Friction. I remembered about friction. In the same way the lizard bored a hole into the wood, one could make fire if they had kindling surrounding it using that very method. But how do I get him to use kindling? A thought came to me as another lizard scampered up into the trees that rose above my soon-to-be fire starter as he worked diligently, albeit a bit lazily, on the rocky floor of the forest. To the lizard that had jumped in the tree, I led to a branch with a false promise of food, just a simple notion that food might be found there. The branch had dried needle-like leaves, ready to fall with the smallest stimulation. Once there, I sent a quick feeling of fright to her heart, and, as I expected, she leapt away to another nearby tree, shaking the branch and loosening the needle leaves to the ground below. I sent her a feeling of comfort as an apology, but with no other way to communicate my intentions. It was the only way I could think of to get kindling onto Firestarter's wood art panel. The needles on the branch dropped as Firestarter worked away below, unknowing. It was a common occurrence at this time of year for the needles to fall so the trees may grow new leaves, but normally not so many fell at once. The mass of needles fell onto Firestarter and his work of art just as another plume was beginning to form. Suddenly covered with needles, rather than freaking out, his hands stopped after a few more twists, and he just sat there. He breathed out something like a sigh as he hung his head. He shook his body, dislodging it of the needles. He was about to clear away the mass from his art piece when he saw a curious thing. The tiny wisp of smoke had grown a bit darker, a bit thicker. By now he realized this smoke came from fire, though he could not see any flames. Partially thanks to my influence he was more curious than afraid. The sigh had been just the thing to help the small flame grow within the pile of kindling. He stared at it, and I had to use a bit more of my influence to encourage him to continue. He seemed to realize his lazy trick for boring holes had somehow started the smoke, and that the needles had enhanced it somehow. He set his sharpened stick back down on the panel, wading through a fine layer of tree needles, and set about his method again, this time in earnest rather than laziness. He would sometimes stop to inspect how the smoke was doing, unknowing that his curious breath as he bent down to inspect the growing embers also helped to aid the growth of the fire. And then it appeared. A small flame lit from inside the pile and reached out to the needles, setting them alight, burning through them quickly, leaving small blackened husks behind. Firestarter sat back as the tiny flame ate through all the dried needles. But even when the needles were consumed, the fire stayed. The wood panel he had been working on caught the flame. The first pop as the fire released gas from inside the wood frightened Firestarter enough for him to jump back. But his curiosity kept him there. A lizard that was passing by came to him, raising alarming colors on her scales, but Firestarter raised his hand to calm her with reassuring shimmers, the gesture asking her to wait. She stayed with Firestarter and watched as the fire consumed the entire panel. Before it was done, a few other lizards had gathered, wondering where the burning smell had come from. Some were uneasy, hesitant, but the flame was also beautiful in its own way. It was small enough that while it did cause some worry, it wouldn't easily set the forest aflame, and for the first time they could see the inherent beauty of fire as it danced along the wood, consuming it in its entirety, leaving only blackened charcoal behind. Firestarter was very excited about his discovery, and set to making another flame, to see if he could reproduce it. It took him some time, but he finally pinned down the method. The female that had first seen the fire with him took quite a liking to him, and they ended up becoming a family unit with just the two of them. He soon taught her how he had made the fire, through the use of wood, sticks, and tree needles. Many lizards were still wary of the self-made fire, but considering it hadn't caused any outbreak of forest fires yet, their curiosity was starting to overcome their inherent fear. It was coming to fruition. The age of fire could finally begin. After all this, I was almost surprised the lizards hadn't created fire themselves already with all the new innovation going on in their colonies. They almost had as it was, and I'm sure with a little more time, they likely would have figured it out for themselves. I couldn't help but wonder, once I gave them the depths of the sea and the heights of the sky, would they have no more use for me? Surely I would not be abandoned, but what could I do for them once they were capable of adapting themselves? Would I just stand by and watch as their civilization raced ahead with no need for my slow methods? Or would I fade away, my role being complete? In all likelihood I would have spent a long time contemplating that thought, but before I could get any further in my thinking, disaster struck. I had been watching my lizards for many generations, and storms and earthquakes were common, but there had not been anything like this. I could feel it from deep beneath the earth. It was like the times I exhausted myself and felt connected to the world as a whole, and somewhere deep at the core of my being I was still connected to the world. It was from that place within me that I felt the tremor begin. Pressure in the ground surged, and a plate of earth lost in the struggle for dominance, capitulating my small world into chaos. The lizards could instinctively feel something wrong from my sudden panic and quickly hid in the holes of the earth and trees. Some of the lizards in the shore colony stayed out to sea, far away from solid ground. The entire world stilled, all living creatures, and even the ocean, were silent with anticipation. And then it began. The earth came alive and it roared with a vengeance. No one was safe, not from this monstrosity. I could feel the shaking earth from my lizards, and they trembled as much from the tremors as their own fear. Families huddled close, hunting parties rushed back to the colonies, all desiring to be by their loved ones' sides. But the earth was hungry, ravenous. It would not stop until it had eaten its fill. Whole sections of cliffs fell onto the shore colonies, family holes crushed beneath the weight of the rock. The tall trees of the forest that had always been a safe haven from the world below felt their roots falter, dislodged from the rock that held them fast. Heavy with age, they toppled down, taking many families with them. It started a domino effect, trees felling trees, crashing to the ground with a great sound of being ripped from the earth. The tall mountain where the mountainside colony made their home found the loose shiny black rocks raining down upon them in a great rock slide. The sparse collection of trees were hit hard from both the tremors and the slides, and they fell like their forest kin. Screams, panic, pain, cries. So many fearful emotions flooded the family heart. I could not calm them, I could barely stay afloat amidst the thrashing mass of emotions. It was difficult to tell where they ended and I began. It lasted for minutes, and the damage was immense. Many in their holes had been buried, and those on the outside desperately tried to dig them out. Although hurt themselves, they came together quickly to free their colony brothers and sisters, before the light of their beloved's heart faded. So many came to me in just those few terrible moments. I was inundated with memories and all the pain of their passing. It was maddening. In the minutes that followed the tremendous earthquake I desperately tried to keep a hold of myself. I couldn't let myself be overwhelmed, not yet. I still had to warn them. The earth was sated, its deep belly full with the chaos it had wrought. No, the new danger came from another deep and vast place. The same tremor that had shaken the earth had woken something from its slumber. The sea had been awakened, and it wanted revenge. Chapter 16, Calamity. Can't get out. It hurts. Can't breathe. Move. Can't get out. Stop. Want to live. Run away. Can't get out. I felt dizzy from the massive panic echoing through the family heart. Although many had perished from the great quake, just as many were trapped or broken, dying very slowly and very painfully. Family holes that had once offered protection now cut them off from escape. Some desperately clawed at the entrance hoping to find escape, others knew what their once loving home had become, a grave. I tried to pull myself out of all the pain and sorrow, but I couldn't just close myself off, I needed my connection. More danger was yet to come. It would take time, but it would be there all too soon. How could I rise above all the emotions clamoring within me? They were begging for help, or begging for release. Desire fueled their strength to help their families and their colonies. Though they spoke no words, the myriad of voices was deafening. I was being swallowed by the mass hysteria. I couldn't concentrate. It was too much. I felt myself slip below the surface of the flood, carried away by all the voices. I felt 1,000 lives worth of pain all at once. I couldn't do this alone, I needed help. And then the little leader came to me, bringing with him all the other stars that resided in my heart. They coalesced into a great power, shielding me from the mess of emotions, but still leaving me connected, and I was finally able to speak. See, danger, run. I flashed the words through the hearts of every lizard. It passed through them almost as if it had been their own scales flashing the words. The words were powerful, a great warning, and it nearly drained me to give such message to every single lizard. But I would not faint back into the world. I had to see them through this. The stars of my dearly departed ones gave me that strength. It was heart-wrenching watching as many of the lizards, despite the warning, chose to stay beside their trapped family members, not wanting to leave them in their final moments. I could do nothing to change their minds. As much as it pained me, I understood their devotion. Others took the burden of their family, bearing the feeble and newly crippled upon their backs to higher ground, some in spite of their own injuries. Some in the sea chose to swim far along the shore hoping to outrun what was yet to come. Those left in the forest that could still climb found trees still standing to seek safety from, carrying those that could not climb themselves anymore. The ones that were not buried in the rubble on the mountainside stayed where they were, afraid any movement might shake the rocks that had finally settled. Those that stayed at the shore colonies watched as the water receded, drawing back along the black porous rock, leaving numerous tide pools behind. The forest colony nearest the shore watched from the tops of trees as the water pulled away, a prelude to the distant disaster that was to come. It was only a matter of minutes, 10 or 20 at most. They could see it slowly rise upon the horizon. It began as a low faraway murmur, but as the rising ocean came closer, the roar gained volume, its anger clear. The wave started breaking upon the newly bare rocks, the crashing sounds rang in the air, but its rampage was not slowed. A mass of frothing white raced ever closer. Those that couldn't move hugged each other for comfort as the great wave finally touched the shore. To the lizards, the crest reached into the heavens, a hand of an angry ocean god come to smite the land. The newly exposed cliff face by the shore colonies got its first taste of seawater as the wave nearly breached the top. The crash upon the cliffs sent the white water high into the air as it desperately tried to climb the rock face. The lower shore that bordered the forest fared worse. The water swept through the trees. It did not stop nor slow for the bodies that braced themselves against the incoming wave, treating them the same as the rest of the dislodged debris from the earthquake. The wave reached as far as its fingers could go, and came close to the mountainside on the other side of the forest. Rocks that had never seen the sea got a taste of salt water as it filled every crack in the ground. Some trees loosened by the earthquake succumbed to the pressure of the ocean and met with their fallen brothers. The sun shone high in the sky, beautiful against the clear blue sky, unaware of the calamity that occurred below its rays, reflecting on water that seemed to have forgotten where it belonged. Broken bodies floated among the debris just below the surface, never to rise. Most were swept back to the ocean when the water finally receded, the placated sea god granting them a single solace for all their pain. At that, I let myself drown in all the cries and sorrows, adding my own anguish to the flood of torment that swept through the lizards. So many were lost. So many new stars filled my memories, and I embraced them all as I choked and sobbed in my own disembodied way. There would be little comfort this day. We would all need time to mourn before we could look to the future once again. Sorrow would fill the coming days, but light would eventually return to our lives, though a little darker for the great loss. And if it became too much, we could rely on one another for comfort. But until then, we would mourn. Chapter 17, Mourning. Earthquakes continued after the calamity, but none so great as the first. Although they made the lizards tense, they did little more damage than had already been done, and soon a little rumble wasn't even enough to spare a glance seaward. Firestarter had been lost when his tree home fell to the forest floor. He and his female had been thrown from their hole, and in the free fall he used his body to cushion his mate so that she may live. She had been badly injured but survived the fall during the earthquake, and she cried for Firestarter as a female defender carried her back into the treetops to wait out the coming tsunami. The bodies that hadn't been taken back to the sea were collected together and those that had been trapped were unburied so that they may at least receive a proper burial at sea. Most of those who had tried to swim away had gotten caught up in the pull of the great wave, swept far away to unending depths as sacrifices to the sea. But the lizards survived. There were many survivors, and they mourned for their fallen brethren. Their voices were quiet but they were not mourning silently. Shimmers and flashes of color filled the colonies, and the night was alight with cries and grieving. Broken bodies, broken hearts, shattered, fragmented psyches, pieces of a whole swirling around with flashes of brilliant colors. I embraced all the new stars that had come to me, seeing their lives play out before me. All their joys, all their sorrows, all their dreams that would not come to pass but would be passed down to the next generation. The last time I had mourned so greatly I had been surrounded by others like me, their black shapeless forms unremembered, gathered around a grave, a body being laid to rest deep within the earth. Inside myself was empty, a deep pit from which there was no return. Eyes that remained dry because a lifetime of tears had already been shed watched as the body descended, and with it, my heart. A broken heart that rejected all love. I was not silent, not inside, though my body showed no hint of movement. The memory had no sound, but I knew I was shouting, yelling, screaming inside the pit that now took the place of my heart. I was lost, alone, and no comfort could fill the void inside me. Another painful memory, this time of loss. The hand I could not reach had perished, I had been unable to save them. I mourned now as I did then, but with a family to keep me from that deep pit of unending sorrow, devoid of love. We all mourned together. The mourning period was long, but there came a day when we began to move on. Those who could no longer walk set about a task of making decorations to remember the fallen, setting the pieces into abandoned holes so that all may remember a family once lived there. Warmth of created fire warmed the bodies of the remaining while their extended family warmed their hearts. Firestarter's female shared her mate's fire with her fellows, keeping his memory alive with every lit flame. And when all her colony knew how to make fire, she left, venturing deep into the earth-torn forest, and did not return. She sought to be with her soulmate once again now that she had ensured his legacy would continue, and she came to me in all her sorrow and happiness to see the star of her beloved again. The shore colonies had been hit the hardest in losses, and those left formed a single large colony in the middle of the cliffside shore to begin again. The rock slide of the mountainside left the mountain colonies in a similar state. Some went back to the forest, but most moved on to the least affected areas of the mountain, afraid the loose rock may unsettle itself again with little provocation. It was time to rebuild their civilization, piece by piece. Chapter 18, Dawn Onward. After the calamity, during the time of mourning, I found a new lizard to name, Scalesinger. She shimmered her scales in beautiful patterns in her eulogy to the dead, conveying words, emotions, and a semblance of visible song. The control she had over the colors in her scales was unmatched in any colony, interweaving a story with delicate touches, intermingling colors with such deft precision it was hard to imagine how she did so without being able to see a reflection of herself. What might have been a mess of colors by any other lizard was a constant ever-changing painting. Even if they couldn't understand the complexity of its meaning, the other lizards still knew it to be beautiful. Her voiceless singing was an inspiration to other lizards, and in the dark wake of calamity, her scale songs shone all the brighter, bringing some much-needed peace to their hearts. Her art was taught to others, most learning how to sing with the scales on their hands since they could be easily seen. The song culture grew from there and spread at the same time as the knowledge of fire. The lizards also got into the habit of something akin to humming, a light shimmer of patterns across their scales as they focused their attention on other things. The most beautiful scenes came as the fires were dying down before the lizards retired for the night. A lizard would begin a scale song and it would spread to the others that knew all or parts of it, and the lizards would sing in tune with each other like a sparkling sky of stars reflecting upon a still pool. The harmony of the shimmering song was calming to my own heart that still needed healing, and I let myself shimmer among their family hearts with them. While the songs filled their hearts, they worked hard to rebuild their colonies. The time of family holes seemed at an end, the fear of being trapped during another cataclysm seemed rooted into their core now. With all the felled trees, they set about with sharp hard stones from the mountain, using simple axes to carve away the wood into usable pieces. They created primitive shelters, straining their ingenuity to its utmost, starting with simple lean-tos to protect from the rain, and advancing into pit shelters to protect from the hot and cold. With only a small bit of inspiration from me, they used the insulating foliage as thatching for roofs as well. Collecting enough foliage for the colony was difficult, with most of the forest being tall red-wooded trees with needle leaves. Broadleaf trees and bushes in the near vicinity were stripped too quickly, there wasn't enough. Some puzzled about how to go about securing more of the needed vegetation. Simply expanding farther outward would spread them too thin. I puzzled with them, hoping for more inspiration to come. It always seemed to come when they needed it, and surely they did now. I didn't know what force it was that governed my memories. Sometimes they were triggered by events I witnessed, other times they came when I desired knowledge, and rarely with no provocation. Perhaps it was a part of myself that didn't want me to remember anything but what was needed. If that was so, after experiencing some of the triggered memories, I could understand why. Some of those memories were awful and painful, and once I remembered, I never forgot them. Perhaps one day I'd be ready to embrace my memories, both the sadness and the happiness. And so, as every other time I desired knowledge, it came to me. The memory was new, peaceful even. I saw rows upon rows of small trees in perfect lines, small flowers adorning their branches. A light, sweet smell filled the air from a calm breeze. I was surrounded by the trees with their broad green leaves and white flowers, each one carefully and purposefully placed. Small insects flitted from flower to flower, a low but pleasant buzz left in their wake. Sunlight shimmered through the trees as the breeze ever so slightly rustled the leaves, making the light dance upon the ground. Surely this place was a paradise. There was a word for what I had just seen: agriculture. Rather than hunting and gathering naturally growing food, you grew the food yourself in chosen locations, raising and tending the food until it was ripe for consumption. You didn't have to hope there was enough food in the wilderness, you could control the amount of food grown. The bushes they used for their leaves grew berries, and the roots attracted bugs. A single bush was good for 2 sources of food, and its leaves good for thatching and insulating foliage. Once the berries were ripe on wild bushes, the sweet seeds could be planted instead of consumed. The only problem that stood in the way was one that often plagued me. How do I communicate this method to them? Would I need to wait until a lizard became curious about what more a berry could provide other than a quick, sweet snack? Likely not. Berries turned rotten too quickly. They didn't last like meats and bugs left out in the hot sun to dry, so it was a waste to not eat them soon after picking. After an accident, the lizards were already starting to experiment with cooked meats over their new fires, and testing other foods to see if they were good cooked as well. Some root vegetables that had previously been ignored for being poisonous turned out to be good to eat when cooked over a fire. And while more sources of food were always something to celebrate, they were still all wild plants. They must learn to tame the plants. I bided my time before the beginning of the next ripening season, thinking of ways to teach them. In the end, after many thoughts that ended up as dead ends, I decided to try something new. Their bodies and minds were calm while they slept, and I wondered if my influence might be able to communicate with them better while they were unable to distinguish reality from dreams. I chose a young female, as the young always seemed more susceptible to my touch. Her dreams were simple as most were, but they were also beautiful. Colors swirled in her dream like the singing scales, and a memory of playing with friends when she was younger mixed with the fantasy of climbing endlessly tall trees, each trying to be the first to the unreachable top. When her dream started dissipating, I came to her. It was more difficult than I imagined, and I felt myself having to divert much of my influence to this one task. It was simple imagery I left her with, several still pictures that seemed to form a story. A berry, a seed, falling into the rocky ground. A shoot sprouting from inside the seed, coming above ground to taste the sun. Drops of rain that the new roots greedily drank. A few images of the different growth stages of the bush. And at the end, a full-grown, berry-laden bush. I felt exhausted. It was just a series of simple images in a dream, but it was incredibly difficult to convey. I could only hope she understood. When I first awoke as an overseer, I don't think I would have been capable of dream images like that. Even now I almost wasn't. But it did teach me that I could do some things that I couldn't before. It made me wonder what else I might be capable of now. I felt it might be time to experiment a bit again. The more I could do, the more I could help my lizards. Even if it took a lot out of me, if I could give them visions of more complex ideas, they could advance even more. However, at the moment I could not think of anything more to teach them. While I rested myself, I sat back, watching how she would use the knowledge she'd been given in a dream. If she was able to create agriculture from that one dream, it would be the dawn of a new age. And from this new dawn and onward unto tomorrow, I would watch over them as always as their overseer. Chapter 19, Where We Go From Here. The young bush tender had thankfully remembered about my dream when she awoke the next day. She seemed to find it odd and curious, as it was likely different from any other dreams she'd had. I could tell she didn't fully understand the implications of my dream, but the seed of curiosity had been placed, and she decided to experiment herself. While out gathering, using a new basket-like item her colony had recently innovated from tied sticks and dried foliage, she began to collect bugs, berries, nuts, and root vegetables as per usual. When she got back, she kept a berry for herself, but rather than eating it, she decided to go just outside the colony border and stick it into the ground. The rows of trees from my memory had been planted in soft, brown dirt, but dirt didn't really exist in this land, and I had forgotten about it until the memory came. All foliage grew out of the black rocky floor, porous in some places like bush tender's colony and along the shore, or solid closer to the mountainside. The plants were well equipped to grow in such environments, and roots often drank from pools inside the porous rock of collected rainwater. In more solid areas they had to rely on water as it rained, or grow long roots that worked their way through cracks in the solid rock to gigantic reservoirs of water below. Being connected to this earth, I didn't find it as strange as I might have otherwise. It was natural, normal. Since I had awoken, this had been the only land I'd ever known. The only times I got to see more were when brave lizards set out for the farthest reaches or when memories of my last world appeared in my consciousness. Bush Tender visited the spot where she planted the berry every day, putting a stick into the ground as a marker so she would not forget where it was. After a few months, her interest was greatly waning, nothing was happening. It got to the point that she only checked on it once a week, probably questioning why she was doing this in the first place. But just as she was about to give up, a sprout had found its way through the holes in the rock to touch the light above ground. It was small and fragile, but Bush Tender became very excited, and brought her family to show it off. They didn't quite understand what was happening, nor why she was so excited about a tiny plant rising out the ground, but they were happy that it made her happy. She kept visiting it over the weeks, watching as it grew. The particular bush she had taken a berry from was fast growing once it broke ground. It seemed to change shape every day, and she was fascinated when it started branching out. Small buds of leaves slowly appeared and unfurled to soak in the sun's rays, growing large even in its youth. It was about half the size of one of the wild plants when it first started flowering, a string of dark red leaves with a few white flowers near the bottom hanging on the ends of limbs like wind chimes. Another unbidden memory. I could see a wind chime with silver pipes hanging from a horizontal post, moving slightly in a small breeze, a small and gentle tinkling sound as a string with a large silver disc clinked into several of the long pipes. Truly the hanging flowers did resemble the wind chime of my memory as they swayed slightly in the breeze. Those wind chime-like flowers soon gave way to berries, the red leaves shading them from above. They started out red like the leaves, but soon became dark, nearly black with ripeness. Bush Tender was very happy, and spent much of her time with the small bush. Anything she could do while stationary, she did while sitting next to her beautiful berry-bearing bush. Putting together new carrying baskets, making pretty necklaces, even eating meals, all were done in the company of her bush. Whether or not she could remember the dream from so long ago, I did not know, but she now had the knowledge she needed. She could grow the bushes as she liked, having access to more berries and leaves. She took several of the new berries, and set them in the ground near her first bush, anticipating their eventual growth. At some point, she brought her family back to the bush, and they were surprised to see a half-grown berry bush where the little sprout had once been. They didn't quite understand, but Bush Tender mimed to them how the bush had started out very small, and then grew into the bush they now saw. She took another berry from the bush and showed it to them. One of her mothers reached out to take it, likely to eat, but Bush Tender pulled it back, indicating she was just showing it to them. Making sure they were watching, she set it into the ground, and displayed her open hands over the hole she'd inserted the berry into, indicating that's all it took. Her family looked at each other, a little puzzled. It might take time for them to understand, but so long as Bush Tender took her time, she could teach them. Not all the berries planted grew, and I felt lucky that Bush Tender's first had germinated. Had it not, she likely would not have tried again. I shimmered in my family heart, sharing in her success. These techniques would be useful near the shore and mountainside colonies, as not many shrubs grew there. The mountainside might be harder to grow on, since they were not located on the porous rock that this particular berry bush used to grow, but they had their own shrubs that could withstand the harsh rooting conditions, and so long as they learned how to plant the seeds of their native brush, they could succeed as well. It would be a very long time before their agriculture reached the point of the memory I had seen, but just having the basic knowledge of planting was enough for now. They could stay safer, closer, not having to venture as far outside their colony borders to secure food and plant material. It put my own heart at ease knowing that. I continued to watch as Bush Tender planted many more seeds over her lifetime, dedicating her life to making sure there were enough bushes to sustain her colony's needs. It made her so very happy to tend to her plants. Bush Tender had been the right name for her. I could see her eyes sparkle every time she came to check on her plants and harvest them, and her scales shimmered in happiness as she worked. It was almost like she was trying to communicate her feelings to the bushes she tended. I felt my heart soften, and I was sure her feelings did reach them. Perhaps it was through me, being connected to the land my lizards stood on. She never personally taught her art to other colonies like the nomadic Scalesinger had, but those who emigrated elsewhere took the new knowledge with them. Soon, all the colonies would know, and with that knowledge would come more innovation. This was only the beginning of a new age, and where they went from here would surely change all their lives for the better. Chapter 20, Water Games. After passing my time watching Bush Tender gleefully work, my attention turned back to the shore colony, which had finally gotten large enough to split into two again. I could see the art of Scalesinger's songs had finally reached them, and they were just as beautiful underwater as they were above. A few feathered family members, children of mountainside immigrants, looked a bit out of place amidst the mostly gilled colony, but they still got along very well. The gills were very nearly complete as well, as most lizards with gills rarely needed to come to the surface to take in air unless their gills were less developed. The gills that had been near the neck had slowly moved to their back so they could expand and exist next to the lungs. Their chest cavity became a little larger than a land-bound lizard's to accommodate their water lungs. The scales above the undulating gills were hard to protect them, and interlocked with other scales when not in use to hide them. Their air lungs were also capable of deflating to a degree to alleviate pressure from deeper dives, though it took them a moment to regulate themselves when they returned to the surface. I could also see a couple families break off from the shore colony, deciding to live in the watery realm, spending all day and night under the water. They stayed where light could still penetrate through the water, and were capable of sleep without drowning. They lied amidst the reefs of coral, and the great underwater forests made of towering pillars of kelp. They offered food and protection, and thanks to the heat that lived inside their bodies, they were able to stay warm even in the mildly chilled water. The adaptation had gone well, and I supposed now I could call the gills complete for my influence over them. Their bodies were compensating well for the watery lifestyle too. Their tails were more powerful than land-bound lizards, though their legs suffered muscle loss for it. When they took to being bipedal on the shore, they often let their heavier tail trail along the ground, providing a bit more support bracing against the ground, using the strong muscles to keep their bodies upright. They were proud of their strength in the water, but not so proud that they didn't accept help on land from their land-bound brothers and sisters. They knew where their strengths and weaknesses laid. A fun test of strength had also been developed in the shore lizards, and even those that weren't fully developed for the water took part. 2 lizards would stand facing away from each other, then twist their tails around each other's, and they would then compete in trying to force their opponent to the ground using their tail strength. The more fast swimming one did, the stronger their tail would get, so underwater racing was also common, particularly among the children who were still developing. There was a little bitterness for those that lost in feats of strength and speed. Some chose to give up and focus on more domestic achievements, others were encouraged to improve themselves and try again no matter how many times they failed. This was particularly true of the land-bound and feathered hybrids, especially the slightly smaller feathered members who had difficulty matching the strength of their water-bound family. Such competition was rare in the forest and mountainside colonies, but they also had far less predators to deal with. For the gill lizards, there was much more to be fearful of in the water than on land. Up to the reef was generally safe, but if they went further into open water, huge monsters began to appear. The creatures in the water were strange compared to those on land. Limbs like legs and arms were a rarity, and sharp teeth were commonplace. Distinctions such as herbivore and carnivore didn't exist in the blue depths. Everything ate everything it seemed, even if it was only a piece of something. When a large predator killed large prey, many smaller creatures would come to consume the leftovers. No food was wasted in a place that could be filled with abundance one day and destitute the next. The calamity had similarly decimated aquatic creatures as it had the shore colonies, and for a time the lizards had to be wary of overfishing, lest they lose an entire source of food. They had to travel for a while inland to get to the greens that provided terrestrial food sources, and some lizards felt it was more trouble than it was worth. Unknowing what they should do, I went on the hunt for them. What I found was something in great abundance just off the rocky shores of their home. It lay in the kelp forest, or rather, it was the kelp forest. Memories of such sea plenty came not in the form of the gorgeous underwater sanctuary, but in strips of kelp eaten raw, boiled, sometimes dried, and had a healthy source of minerals. To the families that lived among the kelp, I urged them to consume when they were feeling hungry. Although wary at first, they did eventually remove small leaves of the giant plant like towers and ate them. They did not feel particularly one way or another about the new food, but it did fill their bellies until their next meal. When their brothers and sisters from the land came into the water, they shared their knowledge of the consumable kelp, and it was taken back to shore to be shared among the rest. The previously avoided kelp was now harvested and boiled with the salty sea water in crude bowls over fires. Some were eaten right out of the bowls, others laid out on the rocks to dry. It was not as delicious as the fatty and bony fish in the sea, but they found after a time they felt stronger, faster, and they did not fall to disease as easily. I knew of the nutrients in the kelp, and while its flavor left something to be desired, it was both filling and beneficial. Thus kelp became a staple food, and although some young disliked it simply for not having much flavor, they soon came to tolerate it, if not outright enjoy its simplicity. The dried kelp kept easily enough and could be stored for a long while, making it yet another good that could be traded to the other colonies in return for dried meats and decorations. The dried kelp kept its salty flavor from the water it had lived in, and the tongues of the terrestrial colonies quite liked it. From the forests on land to the forests under the sea, the lizards lived their lives. Then, were there forests in the sky?